October 17th, 1929. Early morning, Staten Island, New York. Police officer James McGuire was nearing the end of his routine patrol when he noticed something dark along the edge of Highland Boulevard. At first, it looked like nothing more than a pile of discarded rags, half hidden in a shallow roadside ditch. Staten Island had plenty of places where trash collected overnight, and McGuire almost kept driving. Almost. Something made him slow down. The street was quiet, wrapped in that uneasy calm before the city fully wakes up. McGuire stepped out of his patrol car and walked closer. That's when the smell reached him. Thick, metallic, the unmistakable scent of blood. Not a spill, not an accident. This was death. As he got closer, the shape in the ditch came into focus. It wasn't rags, it was a man, or what was left of one. The body was twisted at an unnatural angle, clothes soaked and stiff with dried blood. The face was so badly beaten it barely looked human anymore. Swollen, broken, unrecognizable. Then McGuire saw the throat, slashed wide open, ear to ear. There was no doubt in his mind. Whoever this man was, he'd been murdered hours ago. This wasn't a quick killing. This was rage, precision, overkill, the kind of violence meant to send a message, not just end a life. McGuire knelt down anyway, more out of habit than hope. He reached toward the man's neck, expecting cold skin and silence. And then the chest moved, just barely. A shallow rise, a weak breath that shouldn't have existed. McGuire froze. For a moment, his brain refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. A man with his throat cut and his body riddled with stab wounds was still alive. It made no sense. It defied everything he'd seen on the job, everything he knew about death. He shouted for help and radioed it in, his voice sharper than usual. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived, its siren cutting through the quiet morning air. The medics took one look at the body and shook their heads in disbelief. One of them muttered, "Nobody survives this." They counted the wounds as they worked. Dozens of stab marks across the chest, stomach, back, legs. Later, the number would reach 50. 50 deliberate attempts to drain the life out of this man. And then the final act, the slashed throat, meant to make sure there was no coming back. They loaded him onto the stretcher anyway, because against all logic, he was still breathing. At the hospital, doctors would call it medically impossible. Hours of blood loss, severe trauma, no immediate treatment. Any one of those should have been fatal. Together, they should have been final. But the man in that ditch refused to die. When hospital staff finally identified him, the name didn't yet carry the weight it soon would. Salvatore Lucania, a known figure on the streets. A man with a reputation, but not yet a legend. That would come later, because by the end of that day, whispers would begin to spread about a man who survived what no one else could, a man who looked death in the face and didn't blink. Newspapers would give him a new name, born out of disbelief rather than admiration. Lucky. But in that ditch, bleeding into the dirt as the night slowly gave way to morning, there was nothing lucky about what had happened. Someone had tried to erase Salvatore Lucania from the world. Someone powerful, someone certain the job was done. They were wrong. And as the sun rose over Staten Island, the body that shouldn't have been alive marked the beginning of something far more dangerous than a murder gone wrong. A legend that refused to die. To understand why Salvatore Lucania ended up bleeding in a Staten Island ditch, you have to understand the war that was tearing New York apart in 1929. This wasn't a street war fought by reckless gunmen. It was a power war, quiet, strategic, and ruthless. Old world tradition colliding head-on with a new kind of thinking that threatened to change everything. For decades, the mafia in New York had followed the Sicilian way. One boss at the top, absolute authority, loyalty enforced through fear. Orders were never questioned. Blood settled disputes. This system had worked when crime was small, localized, and rooted in old country traditions. But Prohibition changed the scale of everything. Alcohol meant money. Enormous money, and the old rules weren't built to handle it. By the late 1920s, The city's underworld was dominated by two powerful figures, Joe Masseria and Salvatore Marenzano. Both claimed leadership, both demanded loyalty, and both believed violence was the only way to rule. Their feud became known as the Castellammarese War, and it turned New York into a battleground. Shootings in the streets, bodies in alleys, police pressure increasing by the day. In the middle of this chaos was Salvatore Lucania. Lucky wasn't the loudest or the most brutal man in the room. What made him dangerous was his mind. Raised on the Lower East Side, Lucky had learned early that survival wasn't about tradition. It was about adaptation. He didn't care where you were born or what language you spoke. If you could make money and keep your mouth shut, you had value. That thinking made him different and dangerous. Lucky believed organized crime should be run like a business. Structured, efficient, cooperative, no endless wars, no emotional decisions. Problems solved through planning, not bloodshed. To the old bosses, that wasn't innovation. It was heresy. Salvatore Marenzano saw Lucky as a direct threat. Marenzano believed in hierarchy, in obedience, in the idea that power flowed from the top and never questioned itself. He viewed himself as a modern-day emperor, restoring order through absolute control. And Lucky Luciano, with his talk of shared power and modern organization, represented everything that could undermine that vision. Worse, Lucky was building alliances beyond Sicily, Jewish partners, Irish connections, men like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. This wasn't just disrespectful to the old guard, it was revolutionary. It meant the future wouldn't belong to men who ruled through fear alone. By 1929, Lucky was no longer just a rising figure. He was a problem, a man with influence, a man with ideas, a man who refused to kneel the way younger bosses were supposed to. And in a world where authority was enforced with violence, ideas were often treated as threats. Behind closed doors, decisions were made. Lucky Luciano couldn't be controlled. He wouldn't fall in line. He wouldn't abandon his vision. And as long as he lived, the old system would remain under attack. So the solution was simple. Erase him. Not publicly, not loudly, quietly, permanently. An execution disguised as a disappearance. A message to anyone else who thought about challenging the old ways. They believed killing Lucky would end the danger, that his ideas would die with him, that the war would return to familiar ground. What they didn't realize was that they weren't just targeting a man. They were targeting the future, and the future was already on the move. October 16th, 1929, late evening, Manhattan. Salvatore Lucania stepped out onto the street after a quiet meeting, the city humming around him like it always did. Cars passed, people moved, nothing felt out of place. And yet, something was wrong. Lucky had survived long enough to trust the feeling in his gut more than anything else. And that feeling was telling him this night wasn't going to end the way it started. A black Packard rolled up to the curb and stopped beside him. The driver leaned out the window and spoke calmly, too calmly. "Mr. Marenzano wants to see you." Lucky recognized the man immediately. That was the problem. This wasn't some stranger off the street. This was someone connected, someone who wouldn't be here unless something had already been decided. Lucky glanced inside the car. 4 men, all silent, all watching him with the same empty expression. If they wanted him dead right there, he would already be on the pavement. Lucky got into the car. The Packard pulled away smoothly, disappearing into traffic. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by the engine and the tires against the road. Lucky sat still, calculating. 4 armed men, one of him, a moving vehicle. Fighting now would be suicide. He waited. The car crossed bridges, left familiar streets behind, and kept going. Manhattan faded. Brooklyn followed. When the vehicle rolled onto Staten Island, Lucky knew for certain this wasn't a meeting, this was an execution. They drove toward the southern shore, away from houses, away from witnesses. The Packard turned off Highland Boulevard onto a dirt road and came to a stop. The night air was cold. the sound of water faint in the distance. "Out," one of the men said. Lucky stepped onto the dirt. The 4 men surrounded him without urgency. One of them stepped forward, a thick-necked enforcer Lucky recognized. Tony, a man known for doing things personally. "Mr. Maranzano has a message," Tony said. "You don't respect your elders. You think you can change how things work." Lucky met his eyes, calm despite everything. "I'm just trying to make money," he said. "Same as everyone." Tony shook his head. "No, you're trying to be more than that." The punch came without warning. Lucky went down hard. Then the beating started. Fists, boots, brass knuckles, each blow deliberate, unhurried. They weren't angry. They were methodical. This wasn't about rage. It was about control. "Who's with you?" Tony demanded. "Who else believes in your ideas?" Lucky tasted blood and said nothing. Another kick. Something cracked. They weren't looking for answers. They were making a point, showing what happened to men who thought too far ahead, who forgot their place. After several minutes, Lucky stopped responding. His body went slack, his breathing shallow. "Get the knife," Tony said. One of them pulled out an 8-inch blade. What followed wasn't chaotic. It was precise. One stab after another. Chest, stomach, back, legs. 50 times the blade went in, each wound designed to bleed him out slowly. Finally, Tony grabbed Lucky by the hair, tilted his head back, and drew the knife across his throat, ear to ear. "It's done," he said. They dragged the body to a nearby drainage ditch and threw it in like garbage. One of the men looked back for a moment. "Should we make sure?" Tony shook his head. "Look at him. 50 stab wounds, a slashed throat, no movement." They got back into the Packard and drove away, convinced the problem had been erased. By every rule of life and death, Salvatore Lucania was finished. They never imagined he would still be breathing when the sun came up. For hours after the Packard disappeared into the darkness, the body in the ditch did not move. Blood soaked into the dirt beneath it, slowly cooling as the night air settled over Staten Island. By every rule of medicine, by every rule of common sense, Salvatore Lucania should have been dead before midnight. His throat was cut. His body was punctured in dozens of places. He had lost more blood than a human being could afford to lose and still remain alive. And yet, sometime before dawn, something refused to shut down. There was no dramatic awakening, no sudden gasp, just a faint, uneven breath in the darkness, a chest rising barely enough to notice. Life clinging on when it had no reason to. For nearly 4 hours, Lucky lay there bleeding, unconscious, alone, suspended between life and death. At 6:23 inches the morning, a police officer on routine patrol noticed what looked like a discarded body in a roadside ditch. He almost drove past it. Almost. When he stepped closer, he saw the wounds, the slashed throat, the broken face. He assumed what anyone would assume. Then he saw the chest move. The ambulance arrived quickly, but even the medics were stunned. One of them said out loud what everyone was thinking. "Nobody survives this." Still, they loaded Lucky onto a stretcher and rushed him to the hospital, fighting to keep a pulse that barely existed. Doctors worked on him for hours. They counted the wounds as they operated. 50 stab injuries. Some shallow, some deep enough to reach organs. The throat cut so badly it should have collapsed his airway entirely. They pumped blood into him nonstop. 14 pints in total. More than most bodies could handle. Nurses whispered that he wouldn't make it. Surgeons prepared for the worst, but the heart kept beating. Against every expectation, Lucky Luciano survived the surgery. 2 days later, he opened his eyes. His face was swollen beyond recognition. His throat was wrapped in thick bandages. Every breath hurt. A detective was sitting by the bed when he woke up. Detective Brennan. He leaned forward carefully, knowing this wasn't an ordinary case. "Mr. Lucania," he said, "someone tried to kill you." Lucky stared at the ceiling, silent. "You were stabbed 50 times. Your throat was cut. This was organized, professional. We need to know who did this." Lucky slowly turned his head. His voice came out rough, barely a whisper. "I don't remember anything." The detective paused. You don't remember being kidnapped, driven to Staten Island, left for dead? I was drunk, Lucky said. I fell. They both knew it was a lie. And they both knew why it was being told. On the streets Lucky came from, you didn't survive by talking. You survived by keeping your mouth shut and your memory sharp. The detective stood up. If you change your mind, you know where to find me. I won't, Lucky said. When the detective left, Lucky lay there alone. The pain was unbearable, but his mind was clear. Someone had tried to erase him from the world and failed, and that failure changed everything. Within days, newspapers ran the story. Gangster survives brutal attack. Man lives after 50 stab wounds. One headline called him lucky to be alive. Lucky. The name spread fast. On the streets, in whispers, in disbelief. It wasn't meant as praise. It was meant as explanation. No one could understand how else he was still breathing. But Lucky knew better. This wasn't luck. This was will. And as he lay there recovering, one thing became certain. The men who tried to kill him hadn't just failed. They had created something far more dangerous than the man they thought they'd buried. Lucky Luciano didn't seek revenge right away. That was the first thing that confused his enemies. In their world, violence was immediate. You were attacked, you responded. Blood answered blood. But Lucky had learned something far more valuable during those hours bleeding in a ditch. Time could be more deadly than a gun. For nearly 2 years after the assassination attempt, Lucky stayed in the shadows. He healed, he watched, he listened, and most importantly, he learned. The men who tried to kill him believed survival meant fear. Lucky understood survival meant patience. While the old bosses continued tearing New York apart, Lucky was quietly positioning himself for something bigger. The Castellammarese War didn't slow down. If anything, it became uglier. Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano kept fighting for control, convinced that whoever killed the other would rule the underworld. They didn't realize the war itself was the real problem. Every shooting brought police pressure. Everybody made business harder. Profits suffered. Loyalty cracked. Lucky saw what the old men couldn't. The future didn't belong to whoever pulled the trigger last. It belonged to whoever could end the war. In 1931, Lucky made his move. First came Masseria, a boss who trusted Lucky completely. Too completely. A lunch meeting was arranged. Familiar faces, comfortable surroundings. When Lucky excused himself to go to the bathroom, he didn't return. Gunmen walked in instead. Joe Masseria was dead before dessert. One king gone. Maranzano believed he had won. He declared himself boss of bosses, restored the old system. Absolute authority. Tradition over change. He thought Lucky would fall in line now, grateful to still be breathing. He was wrong. Lucky had no intention of replacing one tyrant with another. Less than 6 months later, Maranzano was dead too. Men disguised as police officers walked into his office. They didn't argue. They didn't negotiate. They ended him. Efficiently, quietly. The old guard was finished. And then, Lucky did something no one expected. He didn't take the throne. Instead, he destroyed it. Lucky abolished the boss of bosses system entirely and replaced it with something revolutionary. The commission. 5 families. Equal power. Rules. Instead of vendettas. Decisions made through discussion, not ego. Violence used carefully, strategically, and only when necessary. Organized crime was no longer a collection of feuding kings. It was a system. That system was born the night Lucky Luciano survived. The assassination attempt had given him more than a scarred body and a new name. It had given him credibility. A man who survived 50 stab wounds wasn't just tough. He was untouchable in the minds of many. Fear surrounded him, but so did respect. And Lucky used that moment to reshape everything. The irony was brutal. The attempt to kill Lucky was meant to preserve the old ways. Instead, it destroyed them. The men who ordered his death created the very figure who would erase their world and replace it with something colder, smarter, and far more powerful. From that point on, Lucky Luciano wasn't just a gangster. He was a symbol, proof that the underworld was changing, Proof that brains could beat brutality. Proof that sometimes surviving is the most dangerous thing a man can do. That night, in a Staten Island ditch, didn't end a life. It created a legend. Salvatore Lucania died there in the dirt, bleeding under the open sky. Lucky Luciano walked away from it, and the mafia would never be the same again.